need to wait until the end to see whether it's worth that or not. You'll notice I thought I'd better dress the part in doing this and go back to, I remember my ICI days with a collar and tie. I picked about the wrongest day of the year, I think, to do that. I know, because there's football on this evening, I have the strict orders to finish this by 8:15. My bid, I think, is going to take about half an hour or 40 minutes or something of that sort. The way I'm going to do it is just rattle through. I used to, when I was younger, be able to remember a presentation and go through it, but I find I can't now, so I have to read it, and I'm going to do my best. I've got my script here, and I've got the slides there, and I hope we can keep to time, and then at the end you may have some questions. As Bernard said, this talk is by Ray Casey. Ray Casey was a keen friend of St. Cuthbert's. He was a ferocious walker and a busy public interest journalist. This presentation is based on an article that he wrote and first appeared in Northern Bylines, which is an internet journal that he writes for. As Bernard said, unfortunately he doesn't have good health, and so he's handed over to us to do it. His work is very recognisable for the reasons I've said, because of his walking. He always tells a good story, he always walks the ground, and he always photographs it. And you'll see in this presentation that that's one of the things that features. What we've done is then add some older photos as well on top of the photos that he's taken. But why were we so keen to do it, rather than wait for Ray to get better? Well, as Bernard has said, this year we've got a programme here in the church of heritage events to mark the ICI centenary. That's a change of gear for us from our usual community events. What we usually do here is holding events that are going to earn money, because we're bearing the costs now of the church and we have to earn our keep to be able to pay for it. But this is something on top, which is a series of heritage events. And that's because the church has to have a long-term future. And that needs to include becoming a permanent home for our heritage. That is the churches, the towns, and the factories. And because of the ICI centenary, this year's programme is a first go at telling the story of the factory in ways that people in the town will find interesting, but also, hopefully, if we get it right, can draw in visitors from outside. And that's really quite important to us. The town councillors very kindly sponsored the programme this year, so we're putting on various events. They're actually paying for those. The events that we're putting on that are part of the programme, you'll see we've got adverts for them around the walls. Do take note of them, because we'd love to see you there. This Friday is a private event for local schools, meeting up with technical businesses with displays about what they do and the jobs they offer. All the businesses are successes to ICI, and it kind of makes the point that heritage is not just a look back, it's also a look forward to an exciting future coming from the ICI connection. In mid-July and again at the end of August, we have 2 events for everyone in Wellington to contribute to. In July, the Teesside Archives and Beamish Museum will both be coming here to share memorabilia about work at the ICI. And a number of owners of memorabilia will be bringing theirs along too and putting them on show. There have been similar events like that in the past, and they've been remarkably successful and a good way for people to meet up. And in August, we're inviting everyone to bring along their memories of the original members of their families who first came to Billingham. And that's rather like we did last year when we invited people to come along with their memories of their marriages in the church, which was, I think, a very successful event that people much appreciated. I think I look on us in relation to the people who first came to Billingham. We're like the Americans. Their positive attitude is said to be because their forebears all actually took a positive decision to go to America. And we're exactly the same in Billingham. Everybody who's here, or most of the people who's here, is because all their forebears have decided to come to Billingham at some stage. And it's about tracking their experiences and their memories. And then in October, we have a first go at telling the story of both our ICI past and our Saxon origins too. And exactly how we're going to match up those two is going to be quite a challenge. But we think we have a way. Certainly one of the things we're going to do is to try and produce a Billingham Bayer tapestry. And Jackie over there, so she's got that in hand. Part of our sponsorship is going towards that. And we think that might be quite an exciting and interesting way to do it. And we're also wanting the schools. The schools are really important to come along and give us their take on that history. As I say, Ray's talk today is the first run through of the ICI part. It's only a start. The story is so massive and involved that it will take years to pull together. I've said we've added some older photos. They are all stills from a film done by the ICI Billingham Film Unit. They're around the walls. They're a bit arty and atmospheric, I'm afraid, but they tell the story because the film, I think it was called Harvest from the Skies, was intended to tell the story of the Billingham factory. The film is one of 8 in our hands, and we'll be showing that at the Archives event, the one in July, and they are fascinating. So do come along and see those. And can I invite you to do something else? If we're going to be successful long-term home for our heritage, we need as many people involved as we can get. We aim to have at least one talk like this every month, and we would be delighted if any of you were willing to take up a speaking slot and put us straight on any of the massive range of subjects we need to cover. Bernard mentioned something, which would make a fantastic presentation, the history of Haverton Hill, but there's the history of the anhydrite mine, there's the history of the low-pressure ammonia plant. There are a whole fascinating range of stories that can be done, and we're just really keen if anybody who can come along and help us to tell those stories, and we'll certainly help them in the process. For this process, we're calling ourselves St Cuthbert's History Society, and we're working with the library so that the photos, essentially those photos are photos you'll see on the presentation, and the text that's up there is the text I'm going to go through with the presentation. That we're going to put in the library so that it's on show and people can see it even when we've got events here. So do please come along to the rest of our heritage events this year, and do bring along, if you've got them, any of those old photos and mementos you may have of your family's time in ICI and how your ancestors came here. So, sorry about going on, rabbiting on about that, which is all sort of preliminary stuff. On to Ray Casey's story. And this is verbatim what Ray Casey wrote, and at the end I've added some comments of my own. And I'm just going to flick through, and I'll just gradually change the slides as we go through. They're not ones to dwell over too much, it's just to give a bit of an illustration. December 2026 will be a momentous occasion in the history of Teesside. This will mark 100 years since Imperial Chemical Industries was founded in 1926. This is an account of that 100-year journey, but it begins with an overview of local industry in Billingham in the years preceding ICI. It will then tell the story of how ICI transformed Billingham from a greenfield site to the largest factory in the British Empire in a space of just 15 years. And then it'll touch on how the company then spread across Teesside in the decade after the Second World War to create the largest chemical complex in the world. The Industrial Revolution came to this area in 1833 when the Clarence Railway swept to the north of the village of Billingham on the way from the coalfields of County Durham to its new coal states at Port Clarence. The Clarence Railway spawned several industries in 1855, Thomas Smith built a brickworks just north of the line off Cooper Lane. The clay extraction left a pit that became Charlton's Pond. Smith's brickworks survived until 1906. Here's one of its products, courtesy of Stephen Tate. The 19th century developments are shown on map 1. Soon another industry was about to make an impact. Salt had been panned at Greetham since Roman times, but in 1859, Bolko Vaughan and Company made a chance discovery while boring for potable water for their ironworks in Middlesbrough. They struck an enormous seam of rock salt. The entire Tees Basin was underlain by deposits laid down in the tropical Zechstein Sea 250 million years ago. Bolko and Vaughan didn't exploit their strike until the foundation of the Cleveland Salt Company in 1887. But in 1871, another ironmaster, John Bell, drilled north of the River Tees. He discovered a vast salt belt that bed at Saltholme Farm. Over the next few years, 3 large salt works sprang up nearby. You can see them on the map, and you can see them if you have a look over there later. Closest to Saltholme Farm was the South Durham Salt Works. Just south of it, Charles Tennant and Partner Saltworks. Both were just east of the small hamlet of Haverton Hill. The third factory was the Tees Saltworks on the other side of the hamlet. Tennant's was one of 48 companies merged in 1890 to found the United Alkali Company. That in turn was one of the 4 companies that merged to form ICI 36 years later. The South Durham Salt Works was taken over by the Salt Union, then by ICI in 1937, so both works eventually became part of ICI. As for the Tees Salt Works, 20th century records are scant. It probably closed in around 1930. The salt was obtained by pumping fresh water down into the deposits. This formed the brine solution, which was then pumped to the surface. Pans of brine were then heated with coal to evaporate the water. The coal came via the Clarence Railway, an industrial tramway connected all 3 saltworks to the railway and also to a jetty at Bamlett's Wharf on the River Tees, allowing the salt to be exported. The track bed of the tramway can be seen at the back of the Haverton Hill Hotel today, where it bridged under the main railway. Ordnance survey maps from the end of the 19th century show a Haverton Hill brickworks located next to the Tees saltworks. The same site was shown as a clay pit when the area was next mapped. Brickworks didn't last long. As soon as the clay within a small radius had been mined, the business moved on. This location was just within the boundary of ICI Billingham and is now part of Cinetec car auctions. You know, when you see these photos, Ray has walked every inch of the ground to go around and see these places, and he's photographed them. He is a most tremendous guy in that respect. Another short-lived venture was Haverton Hill Glassworks, built next to the Clarence Railway in 1837. Sand and coal were transported to the works by rail. There are no records of the glassworks after 1855. Haverton Hill Railway Station was built in 1873 and it occupied part of the glassworks site. This is how the location looks today, with the station site on the left, above Haverton Hill Road. The works would have been to the right of the advertising hoarding. The 20th century began with yet another new venture. In 1904, the Pioneer Cement Works was established at Bamlett's Bight on the River Tees, adjacent to the Tees Saltworks. The owners, Caseball & Co., had relocated their factory from Hartlepool. Their previous works had profited from waste chalk ballasts dumped by colliers returning from the Thames estuary. The new factory imported fresh chalk from the Kent quarries. It imported workers from Kent to Haverton Hill too. The current site can be seen in this photo. But the fabric of Billingham Village remained undisturbed by the new industries, although inhabitants may have worked in some of them. Typical was Tower House on the Green, now long gone. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, Marsh Lane was a farm track leading east from the village, past Grange Farm, seen in photo 7, then petering out at the edge of the River Tees. As the new factories emerged during the 19th century, the lane was extended, running along the northern boundary of the Tees Saltworks, then to Haverton Hill and Port Clarence. The western stretch of Marsh Lane became Chiltern Avenue. ICI Billingham's West Gate was built at the end of the avenue, but the main east-west road through the plant continued the route of the lane. This is a view of the West Gate in 1955, courtesy of Stockton Archive. Apart from industrial activity in Haverton Hill, Billingham inhabitants would have been aware of the even greater flurry of activity. The Ironmasters district of Middlesbrough was booming. By the 1870s, it was producing a third of the world's pig iron. It was only a mile and a half away across open meadows in the River Tees. Villagers would have heard the boom of drop forges, the roar of blast furnaces, and the squealing of overhead cranes. When darkness came, the coke ovens and rolling mills would have set the night on fire. But the outbreak of the First World War was about to have a transformative effect on industry in the Billingham area. As hostilities commenced, coastal shipping was immediately interrupted by the presence of enemy mines. The Pioneer Cement Works at Caseball & Co. could no longer bring its chalk from Kent by sea, so they brought it in from the Chiltern Hills by rail. It remained one of only a very small number of cement producers to remain active throughout the war. In 1917, damage to UK shipping, particularly due to U-boat activity, led to the creation of an emergency ship repair yard. This was built by the Furness Shipbuilding Company adjacent to the Pioneer Cement Works. However, numerous ships were being lost too, and soon the yard was taking orders for new ships. The first one was laid down at Haverton Hill in March 1918. Meanwhile, the blockade of Germany by the UK and other Entente powers had had greater consequences. Prior to 1914, the Great War powers relied on imports of nitrates from Chile to manufacture explosives for armaments. The Royal Navy began restricting supplies to Germany. But just in the nick of time, the Germans were saved by modern chemistry. At the start of the 20th century, Fritz Haber had developed a process for making synthetic ammonia, the feedstock for ammonium nitrate. Haber's process was purchased by BASF, who assigned Karl Bosch the task of growing Haber's laboratory experiment up to industrial scale. This was first achieved at BASF's Oppau plant in 1913. Without this discovery, Germany may have been forced to the negotiating table by the end of 1914. The process was characterized by very high pressures. Photos 11 and 12 show the scale of first compression and then synthesis plant, later in operation at Wellington. And we'll come back at the end and see the significance of that. Down in Whitehall, two separate ministries were concerned about the potential for naval blockades to disrupt nitrate supplies for the UK. The Ministry of Munitions was worried about armament production. The Board of Agriculture prioritised fertiliser supplies. A Nitrogen Products Committee was set up early in 1916 to liaise between the two. The committee was aware of Fritz Haber's pre-war research and came to the conclusion that his process for nitrogen fixation was the way forward for the UK. The government enlisted the aid of one of Britain's largest chemical companies, Brunamond and Company of Cheshire. Brunamond had already considered a site for expansion in Wellington, and the government bought 266 acres of farmland for a projected ammonia plant. I touched on before, how do you link the Saxon period with ICI? And one of the interesting links is, of course, in the Saxon period, the people who owned Billingham were the priors, initially of Lindisfarne, subsequently of Durham. They owned the whole of the area here. They built this church and they funded this church, and they continue to own all the land. Right up until this period we're talking about, which is, we're saying is about 1918, and that land that ICI and the Ministry of Musicians bought was bought from, in those days it was the church commissioners who were the successors in title within the church to the priors of Durham. So there is a connection. Why was Billingham selected? The site was close to an under construction electricity generating station which became North Tees Power Station. Another possible reason may have been the presence of massive anhydrite deposits right beneath the site. Anhydrite, or calcium sulfate, is a valuable raw material for the chemical industries. But how would anyone have become aware of the anhydrite at Wellington? Well, Charles Tretchman had prospected and developed an anhydrite mine at his father's cement factory at Hartlepool. This was just 7 miles away from the new factory site in Wellington. Photo 14 shows later anhydrite mining under the site. I wish it was a slightly better site. It's showing a wagon driving away in the distance, having filled up from a conveyor. Tretchman was also a published geologist with extensive knowledge of rock formations in the northeast. He may have anticipated wider anhydrite finds close to Hartlepool. The massive rock salt discoveries in Teesside hinted at more salt formations related to the Zechstein Sea. The Ministry of Munitions started work on the Billingham plant in February 1918. However, as soon as the war ended in November of that year, the ministry started to wind down, and the site was put up for sale. This sale advertisement in the Times was published on 19th November 1919. The site was bought up by Brunamond to make ammonia for fertilizers. The company created a subsidiary, Synthetic Ammonia and Nitrates Limited, to operate the plant. However, the manufacturing process was still exclusive to BASF in Germany. Even though the Ministry of Munitions had officially lost interest, a number of civil servants there wanted to keep the ball rolling and to help Brunamond. The victorious Allies had occupied the Rhineland as one of the conditions of the 11th November 1918 armistice. BASF's Oppau plant, part of their Ludwigshafen site, on the left bank of the Upper Rhine opposite Mannheim, was just inside this Rhineland territory, in a zone allocated to French control. The UK government was able to organise a visit to the plant. Brunnermond made no secret of their intentions. Let's send a chemical commission and pinch everything they've got. Predictably, BASF gave the commission minimal cooperation. Despite spending 6 weeks at the plant, the British delegation couldn't gather enough intelligence. And amusingly, what they did gather, they put in their bags, and the Germans got in under the railway wagons and pinched all the plans. So it didn't work very well. But Oppau is known for another reason, a much sadder reason. Photo 16 shows the factory at Oppau 3 years later, in 1921, when one of the largest peacetime explosions ever in an ammonia sulfate, ammonium nitrate mixed warehouse destroyed much of the factory and town and killed 500 to 600 people. The town and the factory bore very much the same relation to each other as Billingham did to its factory. You can see in the foreground there the enormous crater that was created by the fertilizer going on. Back at Brunnermond, though, came a lucky break. In September 1920, two ex-BASF engineers with Allied sympathies, August Kabile and René Adler, arrived at the Brunnermond headquarters at Northwich in Cheshire. They had all the plans and drawings of the Oppau plant and offered to sell them for 1.5 million francs, and the offer was accepted. The Brunnermond engineers set to work building a small-scale copy of the German plant with impressive speed and efficiency. This pilot plant at Runcorn began producing synthetic ammonia on 21st January 1921. This was then scaled up at Billingham and commercial production started on 24th September 1923. Although nobody knew it yet, the starting pistol had been fired on a second industrial revolution on Teesside. Within 30 years, this revolution would create the largest concentration of chemical industry in the world. I've just got three photos related to the fertilizer industry. Bags of sulfate of ammonia, a warehouse of sulfate ammonia, most dramatic photo, and a trainload of sulfuric acid. In December 1925, the 6 German chemical companies, including BASF, merged to form IG Farben. The company became the largest in Europe. A similar process had already taken place in the United States, with the creation of the Allied Chemical and Dye Corporation. The UK chemical industry, with prompting from the government, had no choice but to follow suit. Exactly a year after the creation of IG Farben, Imperial Chemical Industries Limited was formed. Brunnermond was one of the 4 component companies of ICI, and its Billingham plant would soon become a key part of the new combine. ICI didn't waste time. Within a year of the formation of the company, it opened the Billingham anhydrite mine. Anhydrite was a triple win for ICI. It was a raw material in the production of fertilizer and hydrochloric acid, and a byproduct clinker was used to make cement. The anhydrite mine would go on to yield 33 million tonnes of product. The photo shows the mine here. Over the next few years, ICI will almost quadruple the size of the Billingham plant, from 267 acres to 1,000. This included the Castle Works south of New Road, completed in 1930. Having viewed an early map of Billingham's industry, it's worth seeing how it looked after the completion of Castle Works, and there it is on the slide. By 1930, ICI Billingham had a workforce of 5,000. Over the next 5 years, major facilities such as the coal to oil plant opened, and the company recruited another 10,000 people. ICI Billingham became the largest factory in the British Empire, and just after the Second World War, the ICI Billingham Wilton North Tees complex became the largest concentration of chemical industry in the world. That's where Ray signs off his account. Could I just add some comments and photos by way of a conclusion? Ray mentions the coal to oil plant. Here are photos of it. This is the photo, and of its opening by Lord McGowan, chairman of ICI, and the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald. I'm afraid this first photo, I'm fascinated by MacDonald, but it's a shocking photo. He actually is the blob on the far right, I think, that's his face. If you come along in July, Teesside Archives has a wonderful ICI 1980s ICI publication commemorating 50 years of oil works, and it has these photos just in clear. They're absolutely brilliant. McGowan in 1926 was then Sir Harry McGowan, a Scotsman. He came into ICI as head of Nobel's explosives, and with Sir Alfred Mond, chairman of Brunner Mond, was the moving force in the creation of ICI. Mond became chairman, but died going into the 1930s to be succeeded by McGowan, hence the latter's presence with the PM at the end. McGowan continued as chairman after the Second War. He was tremendously influential, but ran things with a very high hand indeed. And it was the ICI's experience of he as head of the company, which after his departure caused them never again to have a sole executive chairman or a sole chief executive, but always to operate through a chairman of the board, simply to diffuse control. So McGowan left a very profound mark on the company. And then there's the scale of the factory. Photos 24 to 27, again they're not wonderful, but they give you a sense, is a factory panorama taken from the film, almost certainly in the 1930s. I find the scale of the factory at that stage is almost unimaginable if you think what it's come from within about 15 years. Quite astonishing. And this man was the man largely responsible. He's George Pollitt. He was trained as a chemist. He was a technical director of Brunner Mond before the First War. He signed up for active service in the war, served throughout, ending as a lieutenant colonel with not one but 3 DSOs. He was one of the Brunner Mond party who went to Oppau to pinch BASF's technical secrets. He was then put in charge of the Wellington project as first managing director of synthetic ammonia and nitrates, and he lived at Elton Hall. He was later on director of ICI. I think he's the man with the best claim to be called the father of the Wellington factory. He's described as a pugnacious man, and he looks it. To have created what he did from nothing at the end of the war, in a completely new technology, to what it became 15 years later when we see those shots, the panorama there, must have taken astonishing drive and ability. Yet he is described by the 1930s as a disappointed man. And the fact was that the fertilizer business at ICI, at Billingham, had not been a commercial success, and things had got particularly difficult in the 1930s. There was simply a massive oversupply of fertilizer worldwide, with demand sinking everywhere, and particularly in the UK. Since the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 1840s, the home UK market for agriculture was unprotected. After 1870, steam shipping and freezer vessels had opened the country to massive agricultural imports from the New World and led to long-term depression of farming. Protection was reintroduced in the First War to boost home production, but was scrapped again immediately afterwards. Pollitt spent his later life applying his technological skills to try to improve farming, because with the Depression it was technologically very backward. In the 1920s and 30s, British agriculture was very backward, not a big user of fertilizer. And he also campaigned for a return of agricultural protection. And he eventually saw that come in, of course, during the Second War and afterwards. And he lived on until he died in the 1960s. The situation in the fertilizer business was so bad in the 1930s that very large numbers of men had to be laid off at Billingham. But ICI stayed with the factory and in fact invested massively in coal into oil, which was based on the same high-pressure technology as ammonia synthesis. At that point it was envisaged that oil might be in short supply worldwide. Like the forward view for fertilizers at the time that ICI went into that business, it was hopelessly wrong in the long term. But what ICI's decision to stay with the factory meant was that it was in fact fully functional for fertilizer, explosives and petrol production when the Second World War came out in 1939. Was that simply public-spirited strategic thinking on ICI's part? Perhaps partly, but what seems to have driven Brunner Mond to make an investment of such scale in the first place, and then to stick with it when things got really tough, was the long-term situation in the chemical industry worldwide. From before the 20th century, the industry was dominated by a small number of very large producers. The Germans first and foremost, the Americans, and then Brunnemond and Nobel's Explosives in the UK. And those dominant producers agreed market shares between themselves systematically worldwide. To be at the table and part of that, you had to stay large too. If you fell behind, you would lose your place. So when the Germans established a whole new industry based on high-pressure technology, starting with ammonia synthesis, ultimately Brunnemond had to go along too and lose their place. And go along at the same scale as the Germans. When the first ammonia came on stream at Wellington in 1933, BASF was already producing 1.5 million tonnes per year at Oppau and elsewhere. Brunnemond and then ICI, through the work of Pollitt and his team, simply had to reach German scale in short order. And astonishingly, they did it in 15 years. But as we've seen, without commercial success. When the Germans had followed up by being the first to go into coal into oil, because they had a long-term view of their strategic requirements, they knew they could be cut off from oil supplies, they had to have a way of replacing those. But Brunnemond had to follow them there too. But the ultimate outcome was dramatic for this country and for ICI, for it gave the UK and the company the industrial firepower to successfully come through the Second War, and to then come out the other side into all the business possibilities that were opened up by wartime technical advance. IG Farben, on the other hand, became mired in all the consequences of its Nazification and involvement with the German war effort, with massive and notorious factory premises at Auschwitz, run on camp slave labour. A very strange first chapter to the story indeed. Now I've just got one other element to touch on, because I think it's relevant to what we've talked about, which is why Brunnemond came to Billingham, and he puts it slightly differently from the way Ray put it. When deciding where to locate the new plant, two issues will have been uppermost. First, the output would be very largely for export. We've already seen that the UK farming industry was simply not able to absorb large quantities of fertiliser. And there was no export fertiliser business at that stage, while the raw material came essentially from Chilean nitrate or from hundreds of local gas works. Exports only became feasible once a synthetic replacement became available. It was no different from Brunnemond's initial money spinner, soda ash, sodium carbonate. A competitive and technically protected synthetic process should allow one to clean up internationally. Of course, with fertilisers, it was very largely the slump, the interwar slump in the 20s and in the 30s, which put paid to that. But second, the German experience showed that it could be a business at least as big as Brunnemond's existing core soda ash business. So first, the location had to be a port. And second, it was too big to be accommodated within Brunnemond's existing West Coast works, so they had to find a new place. Another issue was coal. Heavy to transport to a site close to the coal fields. So a site close to the coal fields meant the north of England. Ports in the north were not that common. The Mersey, the Humber, the Tees, the Tyne and the Wear. The size of plant ruled out the last two in narrow incised valleys when a large flat site was needed. The Mersey and the Humber were both possibilities, and indeed both saw chemical and petroleum works develop later. But the new high-pressure technology may have been the clincher for Teesside. Both BASF and Brunnemond, when they were starting, considered partners, but they were not other chemical companies that they were interested in partnering with, but armament manufacturers. And that was because armament manufacturers knew how to build big guns, able to withstand very high temperatures and pressures. And that's where BASF's connection with Krupp came about, because they were their partners. And I think that's where Teesside may have won through, being the closest flat land to the northeast's massive armaments, engineering and shipbuilding industries and their workforce. So that's the sort of strategic process I think possibly that Brunnemond would have gone through in coming to Teesside. One final point I talked about a protective process, and I mentioned how important it was. Brunnermond's soda ash business was based on the Solvay process, with the technology shared with the Belgian Solvay group. It was protected, and that was the core, the root of Brunnermond's success. BASF had achieved a protected process for the Haber-Bosch process, but in the ruthless environment of the First World War, that did not ultimately protect it. One of Pollitt and his team's greatest achievements was that once the technical details of Haber-Bosch were in their hands, they were able to develop it so far that by that 15-year period they had in effect created a new process which was their own process, and which was in turn protected. And that in turn became a marker for ICI's subsequent commitment to process innovation throughout everything that it did. That's what drove it. Well, I've rattled through it, I've got to the end of it, I'm afraid. I've done it it's quarter to 8, so you're not going to have to deprive of your
Charles, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I won't put Charles on the spot, but if anybody does want to ask questions, we may not be able to answer them or make comments. But I would emphasise what Charles was saying earlier on, that this is just the first event that we have in a commemoration of ICI. There will be other events, and don't forget to have a look at our displays. Any comments, questions? Right, well,
I'll just mention one thing, if I may, because I'm always interested in people, and I'm interested in faces. And we went and had a look, Bernard and I had a look at GSI archives and what they hold. And another document that they hold is the ICI magazine of 1976, which marked, let me get it right, the 50th anniversary of the foundation of ICI. And it was a very high scale.
Yeah.
That, I suppose, was almost the peak of ICI's profitability. 1976 happened to be, I joined the company then, so that must have been but it was extremely prosperous. It was on top four, that's it. And there is a most marvellous photo that I hope to get hold of Sir Harry McGowan and Sir Alfred Mond sitting there. They look the two ultimate plutocrats. They're in long black tailcoats, striped trousers, waistcoats, wonderful white spats over there, and they're both smoking the most enormous cigars. But actually, it gives the wrong impression, and there is there with it, and I hope that we get our hands on it, there is there a kind of profile of the two of them, what very different characters they were. This amazing, dynamic McGowan. So Alfred Mond, who was technically extremely able, and really brought with him the ICI tradition of humane and considerate care for its workforce. He was a long-standing Liberal minister. He'd been in the wartime government with Asquith. He left. There's another element we'll touch on in the history too. He came in as chair of Brunnermond literally in 1925 because there was the most tremendous upheaval in Brunnermond at that time. The then chair, who was the other side of the equation, Roscoe Brunner. If you've driven down Mill Lane, you'll know Roscoe Road on one side and Brunner Road on the other. Roscoe Brunner had to resign and subsequently had a very sad story because of problems with Lever Brothers, Lever Hume, who were the Brunnermond's biggest customers. So Alfred Mond had to step in at the last moment, and he had to find a way of handling McGowan. So there are some very interesting personal stories there. Not time tonight to go into them, but lots of stuff, and you'll see quite a lot of them if you do come along in July.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's also another side to this story that we discovered in the archives, and some of you, I'm sure, are aware of, that there were a lot of military developments at ICI Wellington before and during the Second World War. Now, I've just been reminded that the exhibition is really designed for school children coming in on Friday, but please do have a look. I think let's put our hands together again for Charles for stepping into the breach. Charles, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for coming along on this horribly hot day. Very nervous sitting here. Thank you. Nice to see you.
And refreshments are still available.